The period of what is known as the Second Yugoslavia began at the end of the Second World War, fighting which continued right up to the May 15, 1945. The Federative People's Republic of Yugoslavia was proclaimed on the anniversary of the second session of AUNOI in Jajce on 29 November 1945. Slovenes entered the federally organized Yugoslav state with a socialist political order and communist rule as a sovereign nation. The first constitution defined the Second Yugoslavia as a multinational federation with a unitary state and economic area and with 6 republics. Although the constitution did not mention the Communist Party of Yugoslavia, its power was clear. It was embodied by Marshal Josip Broz Tito. The Western Allies adopted the term Julian March as the name of the territories which were contested between Italy and the People's Federal Republic of Yugoslavia between 1945 and 1947. The Morgan Line was drawn in June 1945, dividing the region into 2 military administrative zones. Zone B was under Yugoslavia. During this period, many Italians left the Yugoslav occupied area. An agreement on the border was chosen at the Paris Peace Conference in 1947. A free territory of Trieste was created, divided again into 2 zones. Tensions continued, and in 1954 the territory was abolished and divided between Italy, which received the city of Trieste and its surroundings, and Yugoslavia. Due to the high level of illiteracy, the first elections in the Second Yugoslavia was carried out with balls cast by a voter into one of 2 boxes. The elections could be compared to a referendum for or against Tito's regime. The elections were the last obligation that the regime had formally to fulfill before recognition by the Western great powers. The economy changed in Yugoslavia after the Second World War. Agricultural reform under the motto "the land to those who work it" changed the structure of ownership and agriculture. By confiscation, temporary management and finally nationalizations, the state became the owner of mines, banks, industrial and commercial establishments. On the model of Soviet collectives, farmers began to merge into cooperatives, building cooperative homes. They tried to solve the shortage of food items by the handling over the surplus crops on the principle of compulsory purge. Most of the means of production came into the hands of the state through these measures. Following the example of Soviet 5-year planning, the first 5 years were also planned in Yugoslavia. They were characterized by major investments in the electrification of the country and heavy industry. The standard of living fell, and there was a lack of consumer goods and basic necessities. From 1945 right up to the 1952, food identity cards and vouchers were introduced for the purchase of the most essential items. People played a special role in the reconstruction work. Immediately after the war, organized into working troops, battalions and brigades, they helped to eliminate the consequences of the war in towns and the countryside. In 1946, they were actively engaged in economic reconstruction. The construction of railways and roads, the regulation of rivers, cultivating abandoned fields, collecting industrial waste material, and work in the forests were to the fore. In the spring of 1947, the international situation became more difficult with the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan, and the ever more intensive use of Eisenhower's policy of pushing away the Soviet bloc. The Information Bureau of the Communists and Workers' Parties, founded in September 1947. In its 9 years of existence, the Inform Bureau never realized the goals for which it had been created. In fact, it expressed the opinion only twice, in 1948 and 1949 in order to emphasize the differences with the leadership of the Communist Party of Yugoslavia. After the Yugoslav departure from the Eastern Bloc, dramatic changes gradually followed in all areas. The consequences of the Inform Bureau events in the political and economic development of Yugoslavia between 1949 and 1951 encouraged the Yugoslav Party leadership to adopt the concept of a new economic arrangement. It differed from the Soviet one. It was based on social ownership, single or multi-year social plans, workers' management and partial respect for the laws of a market economy. Under the slogan "Factories to the Workers," new economic principles began to be introduced in factories from June 1950. On the basis of the Management of State Economic Companies and Higher Economic Association Act, which enacted workers' self-management, workers' councils became the legitimate barriers for management in companies, in addition to administrative boards and directors. Self-management was not only introduced into company management, but became the foundation of a new system of socialist democracy, thus marking the whole society, which was confirmed by the Constitution law in January 1953. On a declarative level, the leading party set out on the new path by being renamed the Union of Communists of Yugoslavia, which was done in 1952 at the 6th Congress. With the introduction of a municipal system in 1955, self-management was also implemented at the local level. In the spring of 1967, Stane Kaučić took over the leadership of the Executive Council. He and his fellow thinkers were decisive advocates of economic and political change and the need for political pluralism in social and political organizations and agencies of authority. With a liberal economic program, Slovenia was meant to shift to banking, tourism, transport, service activities, consulting and engineering, and thus became a bridge between developed and undeveloped worlds. The conservative communist wing saw in such developments the danger of the restoration of a multi-party system, and Kaučić and his colleagues were removed from all leading structures and functions in November 1972. Edvard Kardelj, the main theoretician of the Yugoslav political and economic system, also incorporated his theoretical views in the Constitution of 1974. The new federal and republican constitutions provided the basis for a diverse system of social self-management and decentralization of the state. An extremely complex system of political organization and representation was established, which gave the impression that even the most distant voter voted and had representatives in the highest bodies of the republic and the state, delegate system. Several jurisdictions were granted to individual republics, which thus also indicated the possibility for national sovereignty and self-determination. 1959, uniform 8-year elementary school was legislated in Slovenia. In secondary education, priority was given to professional, especially technical schools. The doors to higher education were opened, which led to the establishment of the first college institutions, especially in Maribor. Minority education also experienced changes through the introduction of bilingual education and extracurricular education. Major differences between the profession and politics occur in higher education. In 1952, the Faculty of Theology was excluded from the university. The socialist spirit of education prevailed in schools, which was reflected in the general morning greeting for the homeland onward with Tito. On entry to school, first-year pupils were admitted into the pioneer organization, which was identified by red scarves and pioneer caps. With the transition to secondary school, the children became members of the Alliance of Socialist Youth of Slovenia. Factories also began to invest money in leisure activities and holidays, the building of trade union tourist capacities by the sea and in the mountains established hunting, gambling, thermal winter and forum tourism. Yugoslavia began to open its borders and in summer the number of tourists from Western and Eastern Europe began to rise rapidly. Tourism became an important industry with a high inflow of foreign exchange into the treasury. The opening of Brnik Airport gave Slovenia an aviation window into the world. The granting of consumer loans made buying a private cars much easier and more accessible.